version 2 for Windows. On this tape, you're going to get very powerful with Microsoft Access. You're going to learn how to build advanced queries. This includes including calculations in queries, creating multi-table queries, parameter queries, and action queries. You're also going to learn advanced form and report design techniques. Finally, you're going to learn how to import and export data to and from other sources. In this first section, you're going to learn some advanced query techniques. You're going to learn how to select ranges of records as well as records that meet a particular pattern. You're also going to learn how to select records that don't meet a particular criteria. You're going to learn some other advanced query techniques such as displaying unique values. Let's get started. I'm going to start by double-clicking to close down the Access cue cards. Now I'm going to go ahead and open up an existing database. I'm going to use the Northwinds database that comes with Microsoft Access. That database is in my Sample Apps directory, so I'll double-click on Sample Apps and then double-click to go into Northwind. Here I am in my Northwind database, and I have my listing of tables. I'm going to perform some queries from my Employees table. Let's take a look at what our Employees table has in it. Double-click on Employees and go into my datasheet view. You can see I have an employee ID, last name, first name, title, birth date, hire date, and if I scroll over to the right, my address, city, region, postal code, country, and so forth. Let's take a look over here. I have notes and also a reports to a particular manager. I'm going to start out by selecting a range of records, particularly the people who were born in between 1960 and 1965 within my birth date. I'm going to double-click to close down this table and click on my Query tab. This is one way that I can start a new query. I'm going to select New and pick New Query. At this point, I'm going to add my employee table by double-clicking on it and then close down my Add Table dialog box. Remember, I can pick the fields that I want to display in my output. I'm going to go ahead, click on Employee ID, then hold down my Control key while I click on first name and then last name and birth date. With my Control key held down, I'll click and drag over to the query grid and let go, and now I've selected all of those fields. If I run the query without any criteria, and I'm going to do that by clicking right here on the Run, you can see that I get all of my records, regardless of the birth date. But I want to see just the records between 1960 and 1965. I'm going to go back into design mode for the query and come down to the criteria. Now if I wanted greater than or equal to 1 of 60, that's all I need to do. In fact, let's try that now. Click on Run, and you can see that I'm getting all of the records, even some in the 70s and after 1965. Notice I did get 1960 because I said greater than or equal to 1960. Let's go back to Design View. What I'm going to do, notice where my cursor is blinking before the greater than sign, I'm going to type in between, get rid of my greater than equal to. I've got between 160, and notice that Access put in the pound signs for me. I'm going to click after and say and 1231 of 65. And now I'm going to go ahead and click on Run. Take a look and notice that I do get everything after 1160 and before 1231 of 65, so I have the whole range included. Let's go back to design mode. So I've used between and, which gets me a range of data. I'm going to go ahead and click right here. Notice how my mouse pointer appears to select the criteria for the birth date, and hit my delete key. Let's go ahead and run the query without any criteria. I click on run, and let's take a look at our data. You can see that I have a bunch of last names that begin with the letter B. I have a few of them. I'm going to go back into design mode for my query, come over to last name and the criteria, and let's see what happens if I just type in B. If I type in B and run my query, I don't get anything. I'm going to go back into design view, and this time I'm going to type in like B. Let's go ahead and run the query again. I click on run, and I still have nothing. Let's go back to design view, and this time I'm going to change it to like B asterisk. I've put in a wildcard indicating that I want it like B and then any characters following it. I click on run, and there you can see I have the last names beginning with the letter B. Let's go back to design view again. I'm going to go ahead and delete the criteria for last name. Let's run the query and take a look at all of our data again. This time, let's try first name like A, but we're going to actually make it like A-N, so we just get Andrew and Ann, and we don't get Albert. I go back to design view, and for the first name, I type in like A-N asterisk. Let's go ahead and run the query. And you can see I get the first names beginning with A-N. Let's go back to design mode, and you can see we've used an asterisk as well as the word like to select records that match a particular pattern. What if I want all the records that don't meet a particular criteria? What I can do, I'm going to delete this criteria right here. Go ahead and run it so we can take another look at all of our data. And this time, I want everybody that was not born before 1960. Let's go back to design view, come over the birth date, and I'm going to type in not less than 12/31/60. So I'm getting everybody that was not born before 1960. Go back and run our query, and you can see that I have everybody after 1960. Go back to design view. Of course, I also could have said greater than or equal to 1161. I'm going to go ahead and select this and delete it. Let's try something else. Come over to criteria, and I'm going to say not like A asterisk. So I'm getting everyone whose name does not begin with an A. Click on run, and you can see I'm not getting any first names that begin with A. Let's go back to design view again. Queries become even more powerful when we combine criteria with ands and ors. For example, I might want to see everybody who lives in either Utah or California. Also, I might want to see everybody who lives in California but was born after January 1st of 1961. Now we're going to learn how to combine criteria. Leave the criteria not like A asterisk and run your query one more time. Notice that we have people that were born after 1960. Actually, after January 1st of 1960. Let's go back to design mode. And this time, I want to look at everybody whose name does not begin with A, whose birth date was after 1160. I click over here in the criteria for birth date and type in greater than or equal to 1160. Let's go ahead and run the query and see what we get. I get everybody whose first name does not begin with A, who was born after 11 of 60. Let's go back to our design view. I've combined criteria in an AND by including the criteria on the same line. When I put criteria on the same line, it acts as an AND. I've got two different fields. I've set up criteria for each of those fields, and Access is combining them and making sure that both criteria are met before it puts the record in the dynaset or result set. Let's run this again and take a look. Notice that a couple of our people have last names that begin with P. Let's go ahead, go back to design mode, and come over to the criteria and type in like P asterisk. So now I'm going to get all of the people whose last names begin with P, whose first names do not start with A, and who have a birth date after 1/1 of 1960. I run my query, and you can see the last names of P, the first names do not begin with A, and the birth date greater than or equal to 1/1/60. Let's go back to our design mode. Now I want to get rid of all of my criteria, so I clicked and hit my delete key, and all of the criteria is now gone. If I run my query, I get all of my records again. What if I want all of the people who are named either Andrew, Michael, or Robert? Let's go back to design view, come over to first name in the criteria, and type in Andrew or Michael or Robert. When I run my query, I get Andrew, Michael, and Robert. Let's go back to design view and see how else we can do this. I'm going to go ahead, delete this criteria, and then type in Andrew. On the next line, put in Michael, and on the next line, put in Robert. When I run my query, you'll see I get the exact same results. So I can do it in either way, on separate lines or on the same line. The important thing to understand is that if I now want to combine this with some criteria for the birth date, for example, if I want after 1/1 of 60, I'm going to come over here and put in a birth date of 1/1/60 just for Michael. So I'm going to put greater than or equal to 1/1 of 60 just on the line for Michael. When I run my query, watch what happens. Andrew Fuller still shows up. That's because I did not specify a birth date for Andrew Fuller. So if I have my query set up in this fashion, what I have to do is take this criteria right here and copy it up for Andrew and down for Robert. Now there is a quick way I can do this. I'm going to select the criteria and use a quick keystroke combination, Control-C, to select copy. So I held down my Control key and I typed the letter C. I'm going to click up here for Andrew, hold down my Control key and type a V. Control-V is paste. Come down for Robert and Control-V is paste again. So now I've got ands for each of the criteria. Andrew and greater than or equal to 1/1/60 and so forth. I click on Run, and now you can see that Andrew does not appear. Now remember, if I go back into Design View and change this so it says Andrew or Michael or Robert, and I delete these two query lines right here, I've selected them and delete, I get the exact same effect in an easier fashion. I run, and we get the exact same results. We're about to learn some more advanced query techniques. You're going to see that there's a lot of ways to do the same thing in Microsoft Access. Which one you're going to pick is going to depend on you. The only thing I suggest is you're always going to want to pick the method that's the quickest and the easiest. Let's go back to Design View. Right now, I have Andrew or Michael or Robert. I'm going to delete my criteria, coming over here, getting my arrow, clicking and selecting Delete. Let's take another look at all of our data. I'm going to show you another way to get, in this case, Nancy, Janet, and Stephen. Go back to Design View and come over to the criteria for the first name. I'm going to type in the word in and then open a parenthesis. At this point, I'm going to type in Janet, comma, Nancy, comma, Stephen. Let's go ahead and run our query and see what we get. I get Nancy, Janet, and Stephen. Let's go back to design mode and take a look. Of course, I could have typed in Janet or Nancy or Stephen and gotten the same results. So another way to do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and close down this query right now, and I'm not going to save it, so I'm going to say no. I'm going to start a new query, but based on another table. I'm going to select Table and just single-click on my customer table. One way that I can start a brand new query is with this button right here. I've already indicated what table I want through the table window. I come up here and select New Query. At this point, I'm asked if I want to use a query wizard or just select New Query. I'm going to select New Query. Here I have my query grid, and I'm going to select some fields. The fields I want are customer ID. I hold down my control key, select company name, contact name, city, and country. I now hold down my control key and click and drag to bring these down to the query grid and let go. Let's go ahead and run this without any criteria. I select Run, and here's all of my records. What if I want to see a unique list of all of the countries to whom I sell? Notice I have multiple Mexicos and so forth. I want a unique list. I just want to see a list of all the countries I sell to. I'm going to go back into design mode. The easiest way to create a unique list of countries is to come over here to a blank spot on the upper half of my query grid and double-click. This brings up the query properties for my entire query. I want to indicate that I only want to look at unique values in my result set, in my Dyna set. I'm going to go ahead and change this to yes. At this point, I can double-click to close down the properties and then go ahead and run my query. Notice that I don't have, at this point quite yet, a unique list of countries. What I have is a unique list of a combination of information. To actually get a unique list of countries, I just need to include my country field in my result set. Let's go back to design mode. Bring your mouse pointer so you have an arrow pointing downward on this gray field tab and click and drag. I'm going to select customer ID, company name, contact name, and city and hit my delete key. Now, when I select Run, I do indeed have a unique list of countries. Let's go back into design mode and grab our city and click and drag it down to our query grid. At this point, if I run, I have a unique combination of all of the cities and countries in my customer database. So in other words, if I have 2 customers that live in Albuquerque, USA, I'm only looking at one of them right now. I'm only looking at a unique combination of all of the cities and countries, no matter how many records are found in each city-country combination. Let's go back to Design View, double-click, and bring back up our query properties. At this point, I'm going to select Unique Values and change it to No. Double-click to close this down and then run it again. Now you can see I have multiples for Mexico and so forth. So remember, in Design View, double-click, and it's this property right here, Unique Values, that you set to yes whenever you want to look at unique values. What if I want to select records that contain values as opposed to records that don't contain anything? To illustrate this, I'm going to double-click to close this down and run the query one more time. If I scroll down, I can see that all of my records here contain cities and countries. But let's go back into Design View and add another field. The field that I'm going to add is going to be region. I'm going to drop region in between the city and the country, and then run my query again. Not all of my records contain regions. In fact, most of them don't. I only want to see the records that do contain regions. So what I'm going to do is go back into Design View, come over to the region, and type in not null. Let's run the query again. Now I'm looking at all of the records that have something in the region. Back to Design View, and remember that was is not or not null. In this section, you learned many advanced techniques for specifying your criteria. You learned how to select ranges of records and records that match a pattern. You also learned how to use ands and ors to indicate multiple conditions. You learned how to display unique values, and finally, how to display all the records that contain something in a particular field. Sometimes it's not enough just to look at field values in the results of your query. Sometimes you actually want to calculate totals or averages for records that meet a particular criteria, or you want to calculate the combination of two fields, for example, a quantity times a price. In this next section, you're going to learn how to include calculations in your queries. We're going to use another table for our next few queries. So I'm going to come over here, double-click on the control icon, and say no, I don't want to save my changes. The table that I want to use for my next few queries is the Order Details table. I click on Order Details, and then, remember, I can come up here and click on New Query. I don't want to use my query wizard, so I click on New Query right here. I'm going to go ahead and select Order ID, hold down my Shift key, and click on Discount, so I'm selecting all of the fields. I'm going to click and drag down to my query grid and let go. And now I've placed all of my fields on the query grid. Once I've done this, let's go ahead and run our query as it is now. Notice we get order IDs, product ID, unit price, quantity, and discount, all of the fields in my table. I want to calculate the total quantity of items ordered per order ID. So in other words, for 10,001, I'm going to add up 30, 40, 8, and 15 and get a total on my quantity. The way I do this is I go back into Design View, and at this point, I indicate that I want a query that's going to be a calculated query. To indicate that I want a calculated query, I use this button right here, my Totals button. I'm going to click on the Totals button and watch what happens. I now have an additional line on my query grid. This is called Group By. I'm going to remove my product ID and my unit price. I click and drag to select them and hit my Delete key. I'm also going to get rid of the discount. I'm going to group by my order ID, and I'm going to total my quantity. Click on Total, and let's take a look at this pull down right here. What I want is the total or sum for each order ID. I select Sum, and let's run our query. When I run my query, let's see what we get. Notice that I have each order ID. I'm grouping by my order ID, so I'm getting a unique list of order IDs, and I'm getting a sum of my quantity for each order ID. I'm going to go back into design mode. If I want the total to say something other than sum of quantity, I'm going to come up here, click to the left of the Q in quantity, type in total quantity, and put in a colon. Let's go ahead and run this again. Now it says total quantity, and I have the same numbers over here. I'm going to go back to Design View and change this right here to average. Let's run the query again. When I run the query, I'm getting an average by order ID. For each order ID, I'm getting the average quantity ordered. Take a look at my formatting and notice that it's not really pleasant to look at. I'm going to go back into Design View. To format my data differently, I'm going to come over anywhere over this item on the query grid, my average, click with my right mouse button, and I get a menu. I'm going to come down to Properties and select it. At this point, I want to format my data. I pick Format and use my pull-down. I'm going to pick Fixed, and the decimal points I want is 2. Double-click to close down my properties for the field and then run the query. I get the same results, but they're going to be formatted in a nicer fashion. Notice it says total quantity. This is actually my average quantity. If I want to change it to average, all I need to do is change the wording right here to say average. Run again, and it says average quantity. I'm going to go back to design mode. Remember, I can group by something, and then, using this pull down right here, I can find out the sum, average, minimum, maximum, count, standard deviation, variance, and so forth. There's several different choices. Let's go ahead and try another one. I'm going to come over here, click on Order ID, and hit Delete. I'm now going to bring the product ID down to my query grid. I'm grouping by product ID, and I'm going to find out the average ordered for each product ID. I click on Run, and this time, all of my product IDs are going to be listed along with the average quantity that was ordered of that particular product. I'm going to go back to Design View and come over and insert a new field. I'm going to take a look at this item right here, and notice it says average quantity of my quantity field. So average quantity is my title, and the field is quantity. I'm going to come over here and type in total quantity, colon, and again specify my quantity field. For total, on my query grid, instead of group by, I'm going to pick sum. And let's run the query. Now what I'm seeing is by product ID, I'm going to see the average and total quantities ordered. Let's go back to Design View. So remember, I can include totals, and those totals can be sums, averages, minimums, maximums, or so forth in all of my queries. I'm going to double-click to close down this query and say no, I don't want to save the changes. Let's create a brand new query using the Order Details table. I click on my Order Details table and then come up here to indicate that I want a new query. At this point, I pick New Query. For this one, I'm going to go ahead and select my Order ID, Product ID, remember I'm using my Control key to select all of these, my quantity, and then my unit price. I click and drag them down to my query grid. Let's go ahead and just run the query. What I really want to know, though, is my price times my quantity. In this case, what we learned a moment ago doesn't really help us. What I need to do is come over and add a brand new field for my query grid. I come over and click. I'm going to type in brackets, square brackets, unit price, and my bracket, put in an asterisk to indicate multiplication, start another bracket, and type in quantity. The brackets indicate where my fields begin and end. Let's go ahead and run this query. I click on Run, and you can see I have an expression, expression 1, that takes the unit price times the quantity. Let's give this a little better title. I click in Design View, come over and select where it says Expression 1, and type in total price. Run the query again, and now you can see I have my order ID, product ID, unit price, quantity, and total price. Let's try another one. Come back to Design View, and this time I want to find out, in addition to my quantity and my total price, I want to find out what would happen if I had a 10% increase in my sales. What I'm going to do is select this item right here, total price, colon, and then my unit price times my quantity. I'm going to do that by clicking and dragging over it. I'm going to do Control-C to copy it, come over to a new column on my query grid, and do Control-V to paste it. I'm now going to use some parentheses to group my data, and I'm also going to change the title for the column. I'm going to hit my Home key to come to the beginning of the entry and delete the word total and type in the word projected. So it says projected price. I'm now going to come over right before the first square bracket, open a parenthesis, hit my End key, and then close a parenthesis. Now I'm going to put in times 1.1. To take a better look at this, I'm going to bring my mouse pointer right here on the query grid in between the two columns and click and drag to make this wider. Now let's take a look at what's going to be contained in this field of the query grid. It says projected price is the unit price times the quantity, and then that is going to be taken times 1.1. Let's go ahead and run this. And you can see that I have a 10% increase of my total price, although it's not formatted right now. If I go back into Design View, I can format that by coming anywhere over that column, clicking with my right mouse button, and going into Properties. Remember, I can change the format to currency, and the default is going to be 2 decimal points. I can double-click to close down the properties and go back and run it again. And now you can see I have a projected price that looks a little neater. What if I want to total my total price by order ID? Now this gets kind of complicated. In other words, what I want for each order ID, I want to find out how much money I'm going to be bringing in. The 294 plus the 512 plus the 308 and plus the 345 for my order 10,001. This actually isn't very difficult. I come back, click on Design View, and let's get rid of a couple of our fields. I'm going to get rid of my product ID, my unit price, and my quantity. Remember, my mouse pointer needs to look like a down arrow over the gray button. I click and drag, and then hit Delete. I want to turn this into a calculated query. Come up to the summation button right here, the totals button, and click on it. I want to group by order ID, but what I want is a total, a sum, of my total price. And I also want a sum of my projected price. Let's run the query and see what we get. Here you can see by order ID, I've totaled my price, and I also have a total projected price. So there is order 10,001 with a total price of $1,459 and a projected of $1,604.90. I'm going to go ahead and save this query. I double-click to close it down. I say yes, and I'm going to call this income projection. I click on OK, and if I come down and look at my queries, if I type an I, it's a quick way to get down to my I's, and there's income projection. I'm going to double-click to run it. Access looks at my data and runs my query, giving me my result set, my Dynaset. I can double-click and go back to my database window. In this section, you learned how to include calculations in your queries. You can see that by using calculations in your queries, you can really do a lot of projections and calculations on your data. This is a very powerful feature of Microsoft Access. You should practice these and play with your data and learn what you can do. In this next section, you're going to learn about multi-table, update, and cross-tab queries. Using multi-table queries, you can include the fields from multiple tables in your query results. Using update queries, you can delete, add, or change data that meets a particular criteria. And using cross-tab queries, your query output can look just like a spreadsheet. I'm going to start a brand new query using this New button right here. Notice I have Query selected and then New. I want a new query, and I get my Add Table dialog box. I'm going to add two tables. I'm going to add my Orders table first, and then my Order Details table. At this point, I'm going to pick Close. Notice that up here on the top of my query grid, I have Orders and Details, and Access is showing me the relationship, the one-to-many, with this symbol, the infinity symbol right here, meaning many, relationship between the two tables on the order ID. I'm going to start by pulling my order ID, customer ID, scroll down, and pick my order date, and then from this table over here, my order details table, I'm going to grab my unit price and my quantity. If I scroll over, you can see I have the unit price and the quantity. I'm also going to include a calculated field. I click over here, and in brackets, type in unit price times quantity. Let's go ahead and run this query and see what we get. You can see that I'm looking at fields from two different tables. I've pulled the order ID and customer ID from the order table as well as the order date, but I've pulled the unit price, quantity, and the combination of the two from the order detail table. Let's go back to design mode. I'm back in design view, but I've decided rather than looking at the customer ID, what I really want to do is look at the customer name. The problem is the customer name is not contained in my orders table. So I'm going to add another table to my query. If I come up to this button right here, I notice it says Add Table. I click on it, and it pulls back up the Add Table dialog box. I'm going to go ahead and double-click on Customers to select it, and then click on Close. This is a little bit confusing. To make it less confusing, all I need to do is take the customer field list by its title bar and click and drag to place it before the orders table. Let's go ahead and move the tables around so we can see our lines a little bit better. Here's my customer table and my orders table, and I also have my order ID table. Still a little bit confusing until I scroll up. When I scroll up, I can now see customer ID from my customer table into my order table on a one-to-many relationship, and from my orders table into orders details, once again, on a one-to-many relationship. What I really want to look at instead of my customer ID is the company name. I'm going to go ahead and delete customer ID and instead click and drag the company name down. Delete this field right here, and at this point, run our query. And take a look. I have a company name and my order date and so forth, but now I'm looking at the company name from the customer table rather than the customer ID from the orders table. I'm still looking at my order ID over here. Let's go back to design mode again. What if I wanted to look at my product that this person was ordering? I can click and drag and bring down my product ID. Let's take a look when we run the query. When I run the query, This isn't very helpful because I've got some product IDs, but I don't know exactly what the customer is ordering. We can solve this problem too. I go back into Design View, and I need to add another table, namely my inventory table, which contains my inventory description. I click on Add Table, and I want to add my products table that contains my inventory. I double-click to select it, and then click on Close. My products table is down here, and to make this a little easier to look at, I can click and drag it over. To spread out my lines a little bit better, I'm going to click and drag this one over a little bit, this one, and this one. And now you can see what I have from my order details to my products is essentially a many-to-one relationship. In my order detail table, I'm going to have many items with a particular product ID. But when I look into the product table, I should only find one product with that particular ID. I'm going to go ahead and click on this tab right here and delete the entire column Product ID. At this point, I'm going to grab the product name from the products table and bring it down in between the order date and the unit price. Let's run our query again. And notice you get a message, ambiguous field reference unit price. If I click on OK and come over on my query grid, over to my expression here, I'm going to make it a little wider so I can look at it a little bit better. My expression is unit price times quantity. What's happening is that my unit price field exists both in my order details table over here as well as in the products table which I've added. Access doesn't know which unit price to use, this one or this one. I want to use the one from the order details table. So what I do is click right here to the left of my bracket and type in brackets, order details, and then period, in other words dot, unit price times quantity. Make sure that you don't have a space in between the period and the bracket for unit price, and then click on Run. At this point, I have my results. And over here, I have my product name description for all of the products rather than the product ID. We've created a multi-table query, and I want to save this one. I'm going to double-click to close it down and say, yes, I want to save the changes. I'm going to call this Order Detail Query. I click on OK. I've closed it down, and now I have my order detail query. Let's go ahead and create one more query that includes two tables. This time, I'm going to click on Table. I want to create a new query using the Orders table. I'm going to select Orders and come up to my toolbar and pick Create New Query. I'm going to use the New Query button, and now I've got the Orders table. I'm going to go ahead and select Customer ID and also Employee ID. I want to see the first and last name of the employee for that order. I'm also going to bring down the order ID. So I've got Customer ID, Order ID, and Employee. And now I want to add another table to my query. I come up here, click, and select my Employee table. I select Close, and notice that the Employee table contains the first and last name. Now I can put my first and last name on the query grid separately. So there they are, and they're in two different columns. I'm going to go ahead and select first name and click and drag to move it before last name and run the query. This isn't too bad. I've got the first and last name of the employee taking that particular order, but I'd like to have them combined. In other words, first name and then a space and then last name. Go ahead and scroll down a ways and notice that we have some other employee IDs down here. I'm going to go back into Design View and change this. What I'm going to do is enclose first name in brackets, square brackets. I'm then going to put in an ampersand, a quote, a space, and a quote indicating that I want a space in between the first and last name, another ampersand, and then in brackets, square brackets, type in last name. I'm now going to delete the last name field over here. Finally, I'm going to call this, instead of expression 1, employee name. Let's go ahead and run this query and see what we get. Now I have employee name, first name, separated from the last name with a space. And if I scroll down a ways, I can look at other employee names. Let's go back into Design View and take one more look. If I expand this field, I can see it says employee name is the first name along with a space and the last name. So this is like a calculation. I have a concatenation of my first name followed by a space followed by my last name. It's similar to performing math, but on text fields rather than numeric fields. Also remember that I've just been picking tables that I want to include in my query, and they're automatically showing up with lines indicating that they're related. This is because these tables were related earlier. They were related actually by Microsoft. I'm going to double-click to close down the query and say, no, I don't want to save this one. And with all of my tables closed, let's come up to this button right here and see what I'm talking about. I pick Relationships and notice that all of these tables have already been related. Because they're related, when I use them in a query, they automatically understand the relationship one has to the other. I always create my relationships before I start building my queries. There's an alternative to this. If I double-click to close down Relationships, come over to Query and select New. I'm going to pick New Query. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pick my customer table and also my orders table. I then select Close. If I wanted to, I can come up to the Query menu and select Join Tables. It says to join two tables, use my mouse and drag a column from one table to another. Now these are already joined, but what I would do is take this field right here and click and drag, and I would then have joined the tables. It has to be on a common field. It does not have to have the same field name, but it must have the same field type. Quite often, you want to perform what's called an action query. This means that you want to update your data using a query. You can delete all of the records meeting a particular criteria, append them to another table, or change their values using action queries. Let's see how this works. I'm going to go ahead and double-click to close down this query and say, no, I don't want to save my changes. Let's come up to the Table button, pick our customer table, and then go ahead and select New Query. I'm going to go ahead and pick New Query, and now I have my query grid. At this point, I'm going to use my asterisk and see how this works. I click and drag my asterisk down to the query grid. Notice it says Customers asterisk. This means all fields from the customer table. This would be similar to picking all of my fields up here and clicking and dragging them over. But notice that I cannot specify any criteria at the moment. Let's go ahead and just run the query. Let's take a look at our data. If I scroll over to the right, I notice that I have a lot of different people that are in London. In fact, let's run a query to show the people, the customers that are in London. I go back into Design View, and since I've pulled all of the fields over, I now need to pick the city and drag it to my query grid. For the criteria, I'm going to type in London. Now that I have my criteria set, let's go ahead and run the query. This is just a normal query with the criteria of London. If I scroll over, I can see that all of the records that I've selected have the city of London. Well, I really want to delete everybody that's in London. So what I'm going to do is go back into design mode. I've decided that I want to delete all of my customers in London, but before I do so, I want to send them out to another table so I don't lose their data entirely. If I come up here to my toolbar, notice that I have several different tools. The tools to create a crosstab query, a make table query, an update query, an append query, or a delete query. I'm going to start by creating an append query. I'm going to send the records with the criteria of the City of London out to another table, append them onto another table. I click to select append query, and I'm asked for the name of the table I want to append these records onto. I'm also asked if it's going to be in the current database or another database. I'm going to leave it at current database, and I'm going to call it London Customers. Then I'm going to click on OK. Before I run this query, I need to create the table called London Customers. You come up to your window menu and select Database Northwind. I have my listing of tables, and none of them are London Customers. I want to create a new table called London Customers that has the exact same structure as my Customers table. With the Customers table selected, I'm going to come up to the Edit menu and select Copy. Of course, I also could have gone into Control-C, or I could have used this icon right here, which is Copy. Now I'm going to select Paste, and I'm going to do that right from the toolbar where it says Paste. My new table name is going to be London Customers. I only want to send over the structure. At this point, I click on OK. So I now have an empty table called London Customers. To show you that it's empty, I can double-click on it, and there it is, and it's empty. I'm going to close it down, and since I can see my query grid in the background, I'm going to click on it. Let's go ahead and run our query. Remember, I've already indicated that I want an append query. At this point, I click on Run, and it says 6 rows will be appended to the London Customers table. Those are my 6 customers that are in the City of London. I click on OK, and now I've actually sent the data out to the other table. Once again, I can either come up to Window and select Database, or else click right back here since I can see that particular window. If I double-click to go into the London Customers table now, I have the 6 records, the 6 people that live in London. Go ahead and close down that table and click back on your query grid. Now that I've sent all my London customers out to the London Customers table, I can go ahead and delete them from this table. Realize they're still in my customer table right now. To delete them, I'm going to use this button right here. This is my delete query button. So I've indicated that I want a delete query, and notice I'm going to delete from the customers table where the city is London. At this point, I click on Run and watch what happens. It says 6 rows are actually going to be deleted from my customer table. I click on OK, and it says errors were encountered. 6 records were not deleted due to key violations, and 0 records were not deleted due to lock violations. Proceed anyways. I'm going to go ahead and say OK. Let's go ahead, click back onto our table window, and go into our customer table. If I scroll over, I can see that my London customers are still there. What's happened is that my London customers are related to records that are in my other tables. For example, my order details and orders and so forth. In the last tape, in learning how to create relationships, we got to pick whether or not we wanted to automatically delete records in related tables when we were deleting the parent. Let's see how this works. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my relationships, and notice that I have my customers related to my orders. I'm going to modify the relationship between the customers and orders table by double-clicking on this line right here that connects them. I bring up the relationships dialog box. What I'm going to say is that I want to cascade delete related records, and then click on OK. I'm going to do the same thing between the orders and the orders detail. Double-click on the line, and then indicate that I want to cascade delete. Now this is already selected. At this point, I click on OK. Let's go ahead and close down our relationship and say yes, we want to save the layout changes. I click back on my query grid, and then go ahead and run my query again. At this point, it says 6 rows will be deleted, and then I click on OK. That time, it did indeed delete the records. Let's click back on our database window over here and go into the Customers table. If I scroll over to the right, I can see that all of my London records have now been deleted. You can see that how you set up your original tables and how you relate them is very important. When you're working with queries, it's important that you understand how the tables are all related and how you've set up your referential integrity. I've decided that the title of Accounting Manager is a little bit too long. I'm going to change it to say ACCT Manager. I'm going to run an action query to help me do this. I can close down my table and click back on the query grid. In this case, I don't care about my city, so I'm going to click to select it and delete it. I'm going to come over here and pick my contact title and drag it to the query grid. I don't want a delete query and I don't want an append query. What I want is an update query. I select update query, and at this point I'm asked what I want to update to and for what criteria. What I want to update to is ACCT Manager, and my criteria is Accounting Manager. Now notice that if I don't select the correct criteria, I can have a real problem. For example, all of my presidents might become accounting managers if I'm not careful. So I've specified what I want to update this to and for what criteria. Now I can click on Run. It says it cannot run update queries for fields added to the QBE with the asterisk. I click on OK, and at this point, I'm going to delete the asterisk. I'm going to come up here to Customer ID, click on my scroll box, hold down my Shift key, and click on Facts. I've now selected all of my fields. This is different than using the asterisk. I click and drag them down to the query grid and let go. I'm going to select Contact Title and delete it since I don't want to confuse access with Contact Title that I have over here to the right, where I'm doing my update to with my criteria. Now I'm going to go ahead and run my query. I run the query and it indicates that 10 rows will be updated. This means that I must have 10 accounting managers. I click on OK, and now I've updated my data. Let's click back on the database window in the background and double-click to go into Customers. Now if I take a look at my contact title, I can see that all my accounting managers are now ACCT managers. It's like a search and replace, but through a query. Let's click back on our query grid. Let's go ahead and review one more time the difference between using the asterisk and selecting all of the fields. I'm going to go ahead and delete all of my field names by clicking and dragging over them and hitting delete. Now I've removed everything from the query grid. If I use the asterisk and pull it down to the query grid, I've now selected all fields, but I cannot indicate any criteria. Before I run, I first need to change this back to a select query, a normal query. I can do that with this button right here. Now go ahead and run your query. You can see that you have all the fields and all of the records. If I want to refine my query using some criteria, I can go back to design mode and pull over just the field that I want. For example, city. I pull city over, and now I can indicate my criteria for city is Madrid. I run my query, and I have all the records in Madrid. But I cannot use the asterisk when I'm doing an update query. Instead, what I need to do is bring over all of the fields explicitly. So I'm going to delete the customer's asterisk, meaning all fields, come over and select customer ID through the facts using my Shift key and drag them all down. Now they actually all appear and I can do an update query. For example, what I'm going to do is select Update Query right here. And what I want to do is take the title and change it back to Accounting Manager. And my criteria is ACCT Manager. And if I scroll over, I'm going to delete the city from right here, go all the way over to the right, and notice in the city of Madrid, I am changing my account managers back to Accounting Manager. When I run this query, it says 2 rows will be updated, and I say OK, and it's actually run the query. I could not have done that using my asterisk. Let's go ahead and close down the query and say no, we don't want to save the changes. Also, let's double-click to close down our customer table. Sometimes you wish your database could look like a spreadsheet. Using crosstab queries, it can. For example, I can have the months going across the top of my query dataset, and I can have a product ID, for example, going down the side. Hence, I've made a spreadsheet out of my database. We're going to create a brand new query, so make sure that the Query tab is selected and select New. Crosstabs are kind of difficult, and Access 2.0 has a very powerful wizard to help us with crosstab queries. I'm going to click on Query Wizards, and notice that I have a wizard for my crosstab queries. I select Crosstab Query and click on OK. This wizard is going to walk me step by step through creating my crosstab query and even give me a sample of what my resulting query is going to look like. I'm going to use the Orders table, so I'm going to select the Orders table for my query and then select Next. At this point, I'm going to indicate what is going to go on the leftmost column. What I want to do is look at each ship city and find out the total freight by year. So I'm going to pick Ship City and then click on this button right here to move it over as my leftmost column. So I'm looking at Ship City 1, 2, and so forth. In the results, these will actually be real cities. Now I'm going to click on Next. Now Access is asking me what I want as my column headings. What I want to look at is my freight, but I want to look at my freight by year based on an order date. So I'm going to go ahead and select Order Date, and then notice that right here I have Order Date 1, 2, 3, and so forth. When I click on Next, I get to pick whether I want to group my data in my result set by year, quarter, month, individual date, or date and time. In this case, I want to look by year at what my freight has been for each city. I'm going to click on Next. Now Access is asking me, what is it that I want to total or average or count, whatever. What I'm going to do is scroll down and pick my freight. And what I want is I want to know the total freight by year for each city. Now I click on Next. Access is asking me what I want to name my query. I'm going to call this Freight by City by Year. I want to run my query and look at the resulting data, so all I need to do is click on Finish. This is pretty impressive. What I'm going to get is a spreadsheet, the year across the top and the cities down the side. I'm getting a summary for my whole row, and what I'm looking at is by year, the total freight for each of my cities. For example, if I look at Anchorage, my grand total freight was 1,084.53. That's comprised of 1991, 92, 93, and 94. So there's all of the numbers that add up to give me the 2,490. So what I have is basically a spreadsheet. Let's try one more and do something a little bit different. Before we do that though, if I click on Design View, I can actually see what Access has done for me. Access has picked a ship city and my year and freight, and take a look and notice that I'm grouping by ship city as a row heading, and I'm grouping by the year as a column heading. But if I open this up, this is a rather complicated expression. What it's saying is it's the year of my order date that it's grouping by. So it's only looking at the year of the order date as opposed to the month of the order date or the day of the order date. I'm also looking at the value as a title of freight, and I'm summing the value. I also have a row summary as a row heading, and it's also placing a sum there. So if you're afraid to create these on your own, it's a great idea to use the powerful cross-tab query wizard. I like it quite a bit. I'm going to double-click to close this one down and say yes, I want to save my changes, and then I'm going to start a brand new one again. I click on New and go into Query Wizards. Once again, I'm going to pick my cross-tab query and select OK. This time I'm going to try something different. I'm going to pick my employee table and then click on Next. What I want to see is how many of each employee type was hired per year. So I'm going to go ahead and pick Title as my leftmost column. I'm looking at the title of the employee. Now I click on Next. The next thing is, what do I want as my column heading? What I want is my hire date. And then I'm going to click on Next. Once again, I do want to group this by year for the moment, so I say Next. And then I'm asked, what numbers do I want in the middle? What I want is a count of my employee ID. This is going to give me how many employees of each title were hired in each year. I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. I'm going to call this Employees Hired by Title and Year. And then go ahead and click on Finish. Let's see what we get. I've got each year, and I can see how many employees of each title were hired during that year. So I've done a count. Looking over here in Design View, I can see that I'm grouping by my title and my year of my hire date, and I'm looking at the employee ID and counting them, and I also have a summary. If I don't want my summary, all I need to do is click to select it and hit Delete. Now let's run the query again, and you can see that now I have no summary, but I do actually have my data. Let's go ahead and double-click, close this down, and say yes, we want to save our changes. Cross-tab queries are pretty amazing. Using cross-tab queries, you can basically turn your database into a spreadsheet. Using the query wizard, you can do this quite easily. Remember, once the cross-tab query wizard has done its thing, you can go back and modify the queries to your heart's desire. Also included in this section, you learned how to include multiple tables in one query. You learned how to update tables using queries, and you learned how to delete records and add records to tables using queries. You just learned several types of action queries. In this next section, you're going to learn how to create parameter queries, and you're going to learn about one more type of action query, the make table query. Parameter queries are used whenever you want to enter the variable, in other words, the criteria, at the time you run the query. Let's see how this works. Let's start by clicking on the Table tab. Let's go ahead and just open up the customer table and take a look at it. I may want to indicate my country at the time that I run the query. Here's how I do it. I'm going to double-click to close down the table, and now click on this icon right here to create my new query. I'm going to start a new query, and bring down a few of my fields. I want my company name. I hold down my Control key, select the contact name and contact title, as well as the city and the country. At this point, I click and drag all of the fields to the query grid. Now, if I put in a country of Germany and run my query, you can see that I'm looking at all of the records in Germany. Let's go back to design mode. The problem is that I needed to indicate the criteria, in other words, the country, before I ran the query. What if I want to indicate the country as my query runs, so that somebody else that doesn't know Access could run my query and specify the country that they wanted to look at the time that they run the query? What I'm going to do is delete this criteria and in square brackets put in a message, enter the country. I'm going to put in a colon and then end my square bracket. The colon is optional. It's just something that I put in because this is the message that my user is going to get when they go and run my query. I'm going to click on Run. Notice that I get a message asking me to enter a parameter value, and it says enter the country followed by a colon, the message that I just typed in. I'm going to type in Germany and click on OK. I get the exact same thing. I get the country of Germany. I'm going to double click to close down this query and say yes, I want to save my changes. For the name, I'm going to call it Country Query and click on OK. Remember, when I want to run it later, I click on the Query tab and go ahead and double click on Country Query. Immediately, I get a dialog box indicating for me to enter the parameter value. I can type in USA and click on OK. And now I'm looking at everybody in the USA. Let's go back into design mode. What if I want to make this a little bit more detailed as well as a little bit more flexible? So what I'm going to do is come over here to the criteria for the city and do something a little bit different. I'm going to put in brackets, enter the city. We're going to start with that. Let's see what happens now. For my city, I'm going to put in Madrid and then click on OK. I'm now asked for my country, and I'm going to put in Spain and click on OK again. And I get all the records in Madrid, Spain. But what if I'm not sure exactly how to spell my city or exactly how to spell the country? Let's go back to design view. I'm going to type in like before enter the city, and I'm going to indicate to my user to put an asterisk after whatever they type. So I'm going to put in like and then enter the city followed by an asterisk. I'm going to do the same thing for the country. Like, and then enter the country followed by an asterisk. Let's go ahead and run the query and see what we get. It says enter the city followed by an asterisk. I'm just going to type in M asterisk and click on OK. Now it says enter the country followed by an asterisk, S asterisk, and click on OK. I get all records where the city begins with an M and the country begins with an S. Let's click back over here on our database window, come up to Table, and double-click to open up our customers table. I'm going to look at some of my other cities and countries. I've got several cities that begin with an M, and in the case of my country, maybe I don't care exactly what country I have. I'm going to go back to my query results, go into design mode, and then go ahead and run the query again. For the city, I'm going to type in M asterisk and click on OK. For the country, I'm going to type in an asterisk and click on OK. Now I'm getting all of the records where the city begins with an M, regardless of the country. Let's go back into design mode. So once again, I specified two parameters. I've done that by including brackets that have the text that I want to appear when I run the query. I've made these parameters more flexible by using like and indicating to my user that they need to enter an asterisk. If the user forgets to enter the asterisk, they won't get the data results that they want. For example, if I go in and run the query, type in an M and then click on OK, and then type in an S and click on OK, notice that I don't get anything in my result set. Back to design mode and run it again. M asterisk, S asterisk, and I get exactly what I wanted. Everything that begins with a city of M and a country of S. Back to design mode, and let's go ahead and close down and save this parameter query. I'm back at my customer table, and I'm going to double-click to close it down. Earlier, we created an append query. An append query takes all of the records meeting a particular criteria and appends them onto an existing table. Now we're going to learn how to create a make table query. A make table query does not require that the table already exists. In fact, the table that you're sending the records out to, if it does exist, you're going to overwrite that table. So an append table adds on to an existing table, and a make table query makes that brand new table for you. I'm going to create a brand new query from my customer table. So I've got customers selected underneath my tables, and then I'm going to pick new query. I'm going to select new query from this dialog box, and now pick some specific fields that I want to output. I'm going to pick company name and hold down my control key, pick contact name, contact title, and then scroll down and pick the phone and fax. These are the only fields that I want. I click and drag them to the query grid. If I just run this query, of course, I get the fields with their data for all of the records. I'm going to go back into design mode and now click on this button right here, which is the Make Table Query button. I'm asked what's going to be the name of the new table. I'm just going to call this Brand New Table. Notice that this can be in a current database or even in another database. I'm going to click on OK. Since I don't have any criteria set, when I run this query, I'm just sending out a Since I don't have any criteria set, when I run this query, I'm just sending out a subset of this table to another table, but the new table will only contain the fields that I have on my query grid. I select Run, and it says 85 rows will be copied into the new table. I click on OK, and now I've created my new table. I'm going to leave this query grid open, click back on my database window, and now I have a table called Brand New Table. If I double-click to go into it, you can see that I only have the 5 fields: company name, contact title, phone, and fax. I'm going to go back to my query, first closing down this table and clicking back on my query grid. What I want to do here is add one more field, and that field is going to be a country field. I'm going to click and drag it to the grid, and then I'm going to put in some criteria. That criteria is going to be USA. I don't want this particular field to appear in my brand new table, so I'm going to click in this box right here, which is my box for show, and this indicates that I don't want this particular field to appear in my brand new table that I'm creating. I'm going to select my Make Table query. Notice it's already selected for me, and go ahead and run. It says there's already an existing table, Brand New Table. It says it's going to be deleted before running the query. Do I want to continue anyways? This is exactly what I was talking about. An append query adds the records onto an existing table. A Make Table query is going to overwrite the existing table. I'm going to say yes. It says 13 rows are going to be copied into my new table, and I say OK. Let's click back over here on our database window and go into Brand New Table. Now, not only do I only have those 5 fields, but I also only have the records that are in USA. Because I indicated that I didn't want to show the country field, I can't see what country, but all of these records were from the USA. I'm going to close down this table and go back to my query grid. At this point, I'm going to double-click to close down this query and say no, I don't want to save my changes. Guess what? You've learned just about everything there is to know about queries. In this last section, you learned how to create parameter queries so you could specify your criteria while you're running your query. You also learned how to create make table queries, and you learned the difference between make table queries and append queries. Now you're going to learn some advanced form design techniques. You're going to learn how to create multi-table forms, how to work with the toolbox, how to add controls, change the tab order. You're going to learn about continuous forms, overriding field properties, and how to add headers and footers to your printed forms. I want to create a brand new form. I can do that by clicking on a table, such as customers, and then clicking over here on Create New Form. Now I'm going to go ahead and pick Orders, and then Create New Form. I'm asked to select a table or a query. I do want my Orders table, but what I'm going to do is pick Form Wizard. What I want is a multi-table form. I get a multi-table form by selecting Main Subform. Click on OK. What I'm going to do is show my main order information on my order form, but I'm going to bring in the order detail on the detail portion of the form. So in other words, up here, this is going to be the master information for my order, things such as the order date. And down here, I'm going to include all of the items that were ordered. This is my detail section. If you look at the instructions, it says this wizard creates a form that contains another form. The data for your main form comes from orders. Which table or query contains the information for the subform? What I need to do is select Orders Details, and then click on Next. It says the data on my main form comes from orders, and which fields do I want on my main form? What I want to include on my main form is my order ID. I'm going to double click to bring it in. I want my customer ID. I want to include the ship name, address, city, region, postal code, and country, and also my ship date and my order date. I'm now going to click on Next. Now I'm being asked what I want to include in my detail section of my form. I'm going to select that I want all of my fields, and then click on Next again. I can pick a style for my form. I'm going to go ahead and pick Embossed and click on Next. Now I can title my form. I'm going to call this Orders Data Entry. And I want to go ahead and open up my form with data in it, and then click on Finish. Access is warning me I must save the subform before the main subform wizard can proceed. I'm going to say OK. I need to name my subform. Your subform is actually a separate entity from your main form. So I'm going to call this Order Entry Subform, and then click on OK. I now have my orders data entry, and if I scroll down below I can see my detail. I want all of this to fit on one screen, so what I need to do is rearrange the information. I also want to change some titles and some other things about my form. I'm going to go into Design View to do all of this. I click on the Design View icon, and now I'm in Design View. I want to make this a little bit more compact. At least, I don't want it to scroll down my screen. I'm going to select the customer ID, make sure that I have a hand, and click and drag it over to the right. I also want to bring up my ship name. I'm going to make the form a little bit wider, but I'm going to let Access do that for me. First, I'm going to size this ship name field. I don't think it needs to be quite so large. I select it, and getting the sizing handles, I click and drag to shorten it. Now, I'm also going to shorten the ship address. I select it, and go ahead and size it. Now that I've sized it, I want to move it up to the ship name. I'm going to go ahead and click and drag and watch what happens. When I do that, my form has automatically sized itself. It's sizing the frame for the form, but the form has actually sized itself. This is the border of the form. The form has sized itself to fit the shipping address. I'm going to go ahead and click and move this over to align it a little bit better. At this point, I'm also going to pull the city, the region, the postal code, and so forth over. But what I want to do is get rid of the titles. I'm going to click on Ship City, and I make sure I've clicked on the title section as opposed to the field section. When I hit delete, notice I've only deleted the title and not the actual field. Now I can select the field and move it over. I also want the region. Once again, I don't want to include the title. I click, make sure the handles are around the title. So I've got more handles around the title, only one for the ship region. I hit delete, and now select this and move it over as well. I'm going to delete the postal code and bring my postal code over here to the right. I'm going to scroll down and grab my country, delete the title, and click and drag over here. Let's scroll down and see what else we have. I'm going to bring my form over so that I get my scroll bar and scroll down, and notice that I also have ship via, order date, and I have my subform. What I'm going to do is bring up ship via and order date at the same time. I lasso them to select them and click and drag them up. Now I want to take my subform and bring that up as well. I'm going to bring it up and also size it a little bit. I'm going to size it downward, make it a little bit longer. If I want to view my progress, all I need to do is go into Form View. And I can view my progress and see that now everything fits on the screen. If I move from record to record on my main form, I get all of the detail for that particular order. Notice that my detail changes as I scroll from record to record. I'm going to go back to the first record by moving this window over and clicking here, and now I'm going to go back into Design View. I go back into Design View, and at this point, I'm going to select all of this information and move it a little bit over to the left. Click and drag them as a unit. I'm also going to size the overall form. I have my scroll bars over here. I'm going to scroll down and notice that I have a form footer. I can take the form footer and actually bring this up so that I'm sizing the detail section of my form. To make this a little bit easier, if I maximize my form window by clicking on the maximize button over here, now I get scroll bars that allow me to easily move up and down in my form. So I have my detail section. Notice the arrow indicating that the detail section is down below, as well as my footer section. If I move my toolbox, I can see that right now I don't have anything in my form footer. I want to make some changes, and I'm going to do that using the toolbox. The Access toolbox contains many different tools. It's as if you had a toolbox with wrenches and hammers and nails and so forth. You can pick a tool and then you can use it to enhance your form. We're going to see how this works. I'm going to click on my form to deselect all of the objects. Move my subform over a little bit and take one more look at my form before we get started. There's my form and it's looking pretty good. But I might want to add some text or change some text information, and I might also want to do things such as add additional fields or add pull downs and so forth. I go back to Design View, and first I'm going to show you how to add a label to your form. I have my toolbox. Remember, I said that first you select the tool you want, and then you perform an action. So I've selected my label tool. Notice a little help indicating that this allows me to create a label. Now I come over and I indicate where I want the label to appear. I click on my form background where I want the label to appear, and now I can type in Order Detail. Notice this doesn't exactly fit where I've placed it. If I click off of it and select it again, I get sizing handles. Now I can size it. And I can also move it around. One of the ways that I can size and move things is using my keyboard. If I hold down my Shift key with an item selected and tap my down arrow key, I'm actually making it larger. I'm tapping my down arrow and now my up arrow to make it smaller. If I hold down my Control key and tap an arrow, I'm actually moving. So I'm going to move this. Now hold down my Shift key and size it a little bit. I may want to do something to it, such as change its font. If I come back up to my toolbar up here, notice I have a font and a font size. Also, this is bold right now. I'm going to go ahead and select a font size of 10 and make it a little bit bigger, and I'm also going to italicize it. Let's go into Form View and see how this looks. It's looking a little bit better. Let's go back to our design mode. I'm back in Design View, and I have a lot of other tools. Before we use the rest of the tools, let's enhance our form a little bit more. For example, I want to make the Orders Data Entry title a little bit larger. I'm going to click to select it and pick 18. Take a look at what happens. I'm going to move this and notice that there's actually two different objects here. This is how I'm getting the shadowed effect. I'm going to hold down my Shift key and click on this other one. Now I'm going to change them together. First I'm going to change the font. I'm going to try News Gothic and see what that looks like. I've changed them both to News Gothic. Now I'm going to change their size to 18. Now that I've got them in the font that I prefer, I click to deselect them, click back on this one, and bring it back over on top of the other one. I don't want it exactly on top. What I need to do is play around in order to get it to shadow just how I want it. Now I need to size both of them because they've run out of room. What I can do is first size this one, come back, click off of them, select the other one, and size that one as well. If you have trouble sizing the bottom one or selecting the bottom one, all you need to do is move the top one away again, click on the bottom one, size it, and move the top one back. Now this looks pretty good. I also want to center them on the page. I'm going to go ahead and click and drag to lasso them. That's another way to select both of them and move them over. Remember, this center right here centers them within their boxes. So I can use that one to center them within their boxes. If I want this perfectly centered, I can size the boxes to take up this whole section right here, and then click on Center, and they will center within their boxes. Let's go back to Form View, and you can see our changes have taken effect. I'm going to come back into Design View. So far, you've learned how to add text objects to your form, but those text objects are not what's called bound to your database table. Now we're going to learn how to create bound objects. Bound objects can contain fields from any of your tables or queries, and they can also contain calculations that are a combination of fields from your tables or queries. If I want to add a field from my table, the easiest way to do this is come up to this tool right here and bring up a field list. I'm going to go ahead and select Field List, and now I see a listing of all of the fields in the table. I may want to add the employee ID to my form. I'm going to go ahead and select the employee ID and click and drag it down to my form approximately where I want it. I'm going to take my field list out of the way and also grab the toolbox by the title bar and take it out of the way. Notice that I actually have added a field and its title. Now I want to move my customer ID over, so I select the field and move it over. Now I have some more room for my employee ID. Let's go into Form View and notice that I have my order ID, customer ID, employee ID, and I have all of my shipping information. What I've done is created a bound control. This employee ID field is bound to my table. It also could be bound to a query. I'm going to go ahead and come back to Design Mode. What I'm going to do is add a control that takes the order date plus 30. So I want to know what 30 days from the order date will be. This information is important to me. I can do that with this object from the toolbar right here. This allows me to create what's called a text box. I'm going to click on what I call the AB or text box tool and now indicate where I want to place that brand new control. I'm going to click and drag to indicate a size. This is currently an unbound control. In order to bind it to my table and create a calculation, I'm going to go into the properties for the control that I've placed on my form. I click on Properties. There's quite a few properties in Microsoft Access for a field. We're not going to learn about all of them here. I'm just scrolling through to show you how many there are. Notice I can change things such as the font name, font size, weight, font italic, border width, all sorts of things from right here. What I'm going to do is change the name and the control source for my field. The name is just a name that I can refer to. So if I'm referring to this particular object on the form, it will have the name that I give it right here for the name property. This is not necessary to change. It's only clarification for you of what this particular object is. And if you create macros, you can refer to a particular object on the form by name. I'm going to go ahead and for the name, I'm going to type in order date plus 30. This is just for my own information. I'm going to come down to control source. This is where I can indicate where this data is going to come from. If I want, I can use this pull down and select a field. But what I want to do is create a calculation. If I know how to create the calculation, I can type it right here. I can also get some help from what's called the Expression Builder. This is a new feature of Access 2.0, and it's really nice. I'm going to select the Expression Builder so that I can get some help in building my expression. What I can do is pick from my form, in this case Form 1, which is my brand new form. I'm going to go ahead and add the order date right here, and then I want a plus sign, and I'm going to type in 30 days. I may not have known that order date needed to be enclosed in brackets, but by using the Expression Builder and double-clicking on order date, the brackets were placed in the expression for me. At this point, all I need to do is click on OK, and it says equal order date plus 30. Let's go and view our actual form and see what we get. You can see that what I have, and the format isn't exactly what I want yet, but you can see that I have the order date plus 30 days. This was May 10th, and this is June 9th, both in 1991. Let's go back into Design View and modify a couple more properties in order to format this field, like this field over here. Now maybe I'm not sure what the format is for this field, the order date. All I need to do is click on it, and now I'm looking at the properties for the order date. I'm going to double click to close down my toolbox and get it out of the way. I can see that the name of this text box is order date, the control source where it's coming from is my order date field, and the format is medium date. I can click back over here, and for my format, use the pull down and pick medium date. I also want to change my title. If I move my property box away a little bit, you can see that most of my handles are around the data source. If I click back on my actual title and bring my properties box over, you can see that this still has the name of text 38 and its caption is field 37. I'm not going to change the name, but I am going to change the caption. My caption is going to be date plus 30. I'm going to click back onto my form over here, and I can see that my caption doesn't quite fit. I'm going to close down the properties by double-clicking. I can also close them down by clicking on my Properties tool right here. I'm going to use the double-click method. And now, click on this title, and holding down my Shift key and my right arrow, make it a little bit larger. If I click off of it, now you can see I have date plus 30. Let's go into Form View. That looks a lot better. I may want to align these objects right here up with my country right here. Axis can help me to do that. I go back into Design View and pick, by lassoing, all of the fields that I want. Now notice that I've accidentally picked Ship Region. To deselect it, I hold down my Shift key and click just on that one object, and I deselected that one object. Now I'm going to come up to my Format menu, select Align, and I'm going to align all of these to the bottom. They are now all aligned to the bottom, and these particular objects over here move down. I'm going to select Ship Via and center it a little bit better in between the two objects. Now I'm going to go back to Form View and take a look. Looks pretty nice. I go back into Design View, and we're going to review just a little bit. Right now I have my field list up. This is a list of all of the fields in my table or my query that I'm using for this form. If I want to remove that list, I can double-click on this control icon right here, or I can come up to the toolbar and click on this button, Field List. The toggle, on and off. Same thing with the properties of the object that I currently have selected, on and off. If I need some help on one of my properties, all I need to do is go into Properties and pick the particular item that I need help on. For example, what if I need help on Control Source? I click on Control Source and then hit my F1 key. I get help on exactly the property that I was in. Notice that I'm looking at my Control Source property. And I actually can go into C also, and I can pick, for example, binding a control to a field, creating a calculated control. I'm going to click on creating a calculated control. I even get examples. And here we have some examples of some calculated controls. Notice, for example, quantity times price or price times 1.06. This one right here is similar to my order date plus 30. I'm going to double click to close down Microsoft Access Help. I've worked quite a bit on this form. I'm not ready to exit it yet, so I'm going to come over here and click on the Save button so that I can save this form without exiting it. It doesn't have a name yet. I'm going to call it Orders Data Entry. We named our subform earlier, but we never named our main form. I click on OK. Let's come up to the Window menu and select Database. If I take a look at my forms, notice I have the database window maximized. But if I look at my listing of forms, I can see that I have my Orders Data Entry form as well as my Order Entry subform. I'm going to go back to my Window menu and go back to my form. Sometimes you want to limit the data entry choices for your user. You can create option groups. Option groups allow you to specify multiple choice entries for a particular field. I want to add some radio buttons for ship via. I want to force the user of the form to choose between UPS, FedEx, and the US Mail. I'm going to select by clicking on them using my Shift key all of these objects and click and drag them down a little bit to give myself some room. I'm now going to delete the ship via that we already have. At this point, I want to add an option group. My toolbox is no longer up on the screen. I can come up to the View menu and select Toolbox. Now I'm viewing my toolbox. This button right here allows me to create an option group. I click on it and then come over to indicate where I want my option group to appear. I'm going to click and drag to select the spot for my option group. Microsoft Access 2 loads what's called an option group wizard. This is going to take me step by step through creating my option group. I need to type some names, some label names for my choices for my option group. I'm going to type in UPS, Federal Express, and US Mail. Now I'm going to click on Next. Remember, those options are going to appear right here. I'm asked if I want to select a default. I do. My default's going to be Federal Express. Now I click on Next. Values are going to be assigned depending upon whether my user has picked UPS, Federal Express, or US Mail. If they pick UPS, the value of 1 will actually be stored in the table. If they pick Federal Express, the value of 2, and US Mail, the value of 3. This is fine with me, so I'm going to click on Next. When my user picks from the various options, I want to store that value in a field. To pick what field I want to store the value in, I click on this drop down right here, scroll down, and pick Ship Via. So the value 1, 2, or 3 is going to be stored in the Ship Via field. Now I click on Next. I'm asked what style I want for my option group. Take a look at the sample over here that I have right now. If I pick raised, it looks like this, and sunken, it looks like this. I like raised, so I'm going to leave it at raised, and I want option boxes as opposed to check boxes or toggle buttons. I'm going to pick option buttons and then click on Next. Finally, what label do I want for my option group? I'm going to go ahead and type in Ship Via. I also want to open up cue cards to help me out in customizing my option group. So I'm going to select that and click on Finish. Not only have I placed this option group on the screen, but I also have some cue cards over here that indicate I can set my properties for my option group, do other design work on the form, or I finished designing the form. If I wanted to learn about setting properties for my option group, I click right here, and I'm getting some help. I can click on Next and get even more information. next again. I actually get some step-by-step. So I can come over and work with my option group over here or come back to my cue cards. I'm going to close down my cue cards. Click anywhere on my form. I'm going to click back over here on Ship Via. I only want to take the Ship Via title and move it over. Remember, I need to get a hand with a finger to move an individual control. I click and drag, and now I've moved the Ship Via title over. I also want to move my order date and my date plus 30 down a little bit. Now let's take a look at what our form looks like. When I go into Form View, notice that I have U.S. Mail selected for this particular record. That's because this particular record has a value of 3 in the Ship Via field. If I move to the next record, it's still U.S. Mail. But as I scroll through, you can see that some of my Ship Vias change. One way I can go to my very last record and start data entry for a new record is with this button right here. I'm going to click on that button, and now I'm going to put in a new order ID. My new order ID is going to be order ID number 7000. I tab over to customer ID and type in customer number 2. Notice when I hit tab that I didn't move over to employee ID. I actually have a problem with my tab order, and we're going to learn how to change our tab order in a little bit. But what I'd like you to take note of is that Federal Express is automatically selected. That's because we selected Federal Express as our default for our field value. I'm going to go back to a prior record, and notice I can't add or change the record. It says referential integrity rules require a related record in my table customers. I click on OK, and my problem is that customer ID 2 does not exist in my customer table. If I type in ALFKI, which is a valid customer ID, and hit my tab key, and now I try to come off of this record, I can do so. Go back to it again, and Federal Express is still selected. I can also change my value for this option group for any of the records. I'm going to go back to order ID number 11077 and change it to UPS. I move off of the record and come back, and it still says UPS. I'm actually changing the underlying field value to the number 1. Sometimes you want to add multiple of the same objects onto your form. To do this, we use the Lock tool. Let's learn about that. I'm going to go back into Design View. I may want to add several different labels onto my form. I don't want to have to keep selecting the Label tool, coming over, add a label, and then come back and select my Label tool again. What I do instead is select my tool Lock over here. At this point, if I click to type in a label, I can type in my label. I can go over somewhere else and click again and type in another label. Notice whatever I do, I still have my Label tool. In order to unlock, I need to go back to the Lock tool, click on it again, and now I'm unlocked. At this point, I can click on my Select Objects item right over here, and now come back and select the My Label tool, as well as another label, and delete them both. Remember when you were in Form View and you hit your Tab key, and your cursor didn't exactly move in the order that you wanted it to? We're going to learn how to change our tab order of the objects on our form. Let's take a look one more time at what I'm talking about. If I go into Form View and start hitting my Tab key, I don't necessarily move logically from item to item. If I click back up here on Ship Name, I move over to Ship Address. I'm not getting over to Ship Via, and I'm skipping my date plus 30. I'm going to go back into Design View, and let's see how we can change our tab order. Come up to my Edit menu, and one of my options is Tab Order. This is the order that I tab around my form. First, I want to change my form order for the detail section of my form. Notice I have order ID followed by customer ID. If I move this box around a little bit, I can see that then I want my employee ID. To move my employee ID up in tab order, I can click to select it and click and drag to move it up. Now I want my ship name, and then I want ship via. So I come down here and find my ship via. My ship via is currently called Field 39. Remember how I showed you to change the name of a control? This is why. It's difficult to know what Field 39 is. I know right now that it is my ship via, so I'm going to go ahead and click and drag it and place it after the ship name. Then I want my ship address, city, region, postal code, country, and then order date. But after that, I want my order date plus 30. So I select it and click and drag up. Finally, I want my order entry subform. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK, and let's go back into our form view and tab through our form. As I tab, I now move over to employee ID, ship name. Now I'm on ship via. If you look real closely, you can see a thin dotted line around UPS, and I can actually use my up and down arrow to move within this option group. If I hit tab, I move over to ship address, now order date, and then the date plus 30 before I go into my order detail. I'm going to go back into design view. Let's take a look at what this form would print like if I were to send it to the printer. Remember, I can click on print preview to see what this would look like as a printed form. If I zoom in, I can take a look and notice what this would look like if I were to print it out. Notice that I have no header or footer. For example, I have no page numbers indicating what page I'm on. I'm just looking at my records, my data entry forms. If I want to set up a header or a footer, I can go over to here to Print Setup. I click on Print Setup. Notice through here I can change my orientation to portrait or landscape. I can change my printer as well as my margins. I'm going to click on More. I can also indicate how many items across and my row spacing, my width, and my height. What I want to do is actually change and add a header or a footer. So here's some places that I can change various things about my printout. I'm going to leave these as is and click on OK. I'm going to click on this Close Window button right here, and I'm back in design mode. I'm going to come up to the Format menu and select Page, Header, and Footer. I've now added a section. In addition to my form header and my form footer down below, I also have a page header. I want to add some things to my page header. I'm going to go ahead and put a created by and a date and a page number. To do that, I'm going to add a text box. I select text box and come over and click in my header. I need some help with this text box. I'm going to click on Properties and now indicate a control source. I need my expression builder to help me out. I want to put in the date, and let's say you're not sure exactly how to specify the date. Now I know it's date, open paren, close paren, but I'm not quite sure, so I'm going to select Functions, double click, and then double click on Built-in Functions. I'm getting a list of my built-in functions. They're categorized. If I select date and time, and then go over here and double click on date, there's my date, open paren, close paren. I'm going to click on OK. Now I have my control source of date. I'm going to come over here and click on the title and type in, for my caption, date and a colon. Let's go ahead and add a page number. To do that, I need my toolbox. My toolbox is hiding back here. I'm going to move my properties around, grab my toolbox, and grab another text box. At this point, I want to move my properties box around and place my page number right over here. Once again, I need my properties. I go into Control Source and click to bring up my expression builder. I need some help to get the page number. This time, I want common expressions. I'm going to double-click to select common expressions. I'm going to select this page N of M. I double-click to select it, and there I get the expression to place page N of M on my report. I'm going to click on OK. Come over here, click on the title, and delete it. Let's go ahead and view our form. In Form View, I don't actually see my page header, but when I select Print Preview, now we can take a look and see that this says the date, and it also says page 1 of 408. If I go to my next page, I'm going to maximize my printout here, and go to my next page. It says page 2 of 408, page 3 of 408, and so forth. I'm going to zoom out, and you can see that every page at the top has the date and the page number out of how many pages. I'm going to click on my Close button. I'm going to restore the size of my form, move it over, and double-click to close it down and say yes that I want to save my changes. In this section, you learned many advanced form techniques. You learned how to work with multi-table forms and how to use the Access toolbox. You also learned how to add controls to your forms. You learned how to change the tab order of the controls on your form and how to add headers and footers to your printed form. You just learned some advanced form techniques. Now we're going to learn some advanced report techniques. You're going to learn how to create a report from a blank form. You're also going to learn how to work with sorting and grouping. You're going to learn how to create sub-reports and how to add and delete report sections. Let's get started. Let's create a report based on a query. I'm going to come up here and click on my Query tab and find the query called Products and Suppliers. Here's the query, and now that I've selected it, all I need to do to create a report from it is come up here to this button right here, which is New Report, and click on it. Notice that Access knows that I'm creating a report based on the query Products and Suppliers. I'm going to go ahead and click on Blank Report, so we're going to start a report from scratch without the report wizard. Notice that all I get is a page header, detail, and page footer. Notice that there's no fields. In fact, if I were to preview this, nothing would appear. You can see we have a completely blank report. Now that I'm back in design mode, let's add some fields to this report. What I'm going to do is come up here to my Field List button on my toolbar and click on it. I now have a listing of all of the fields that are in my query. I'm going to go ahead and pick a few of those fields. I'm going to pick the product ID, supplier ID, and I'm holding down my Control key and selecting each one. I'm also going to pick the quantity per unit and the unit price. Those are the only fields that I'm going to bring to my report. Now that I've selected all four of those fields using the Control key, I'm going to click and drag them down to the Detail section of my report and let go. I'm going to double-click to close down my field list and also move my toolbox over to the left side, out of the way. You can see that what I have are the four fields in my Detail section. Now, if I were to print this out right now, let's see what we get. I'm going to come over to Print Preview and click on it. If I zoom in, you can see that I have product ID, supplier ID, quantity, and unit price for each of my products, for each of the line items or records that are in my Dynaset, my query results. I'm going to go back to design mode. What I really want to do is take my titles and move them up to the page header, and I also want to create a calculated field, which is going to be my quantity per unit times the unit price. In order to do that, I've just selected the product ID. I'm going to do Control X to cut it. Now I'm going to click on my page header band and do Control V, which is paste. Now I can get my hand and move this over. I'm going to do the same thing with the supplier title. The quantity title. Make sure you're selecting the titles as opposed to the field. Once again, each time I'm selecting the title, doing Control X, which is cut, coming up, clicking on the page header band, Control V, which is paste, and then moving the control over to where I want it. Now I'm just going to move my fields around. I'm going to make my product ID a little bit shorter and do the same thing with my supplier ID. Bring up my quantity per unit and my unit price. I'm also going to collapse down my detail section. If I were to print this right now, let's take a look in Print Preview and notice there's a very large space in between each of my records. I'm going to go ahead and select Close Window, collapse this, and print again. If I zoom in, you can see I have a product ID, a supplier ID, a quantity per unit, and a unit price. Let's go back and fix this up a little bit so it's a little bit neater. I'm going to take my product ID and line it up a little bit better with the title. I'm now going to select the title and the field and send them both over to the right so that within their boxes they're right aligned. On the supplier ID, I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, select the title and the field, and again send them over to the right side. I'm going to do the same thing for my quantity per unit. Select them both and send them over to the right. And also for my unit price, I'm going to make it shorter and then send them both over to the right also. Let's take a look at what we have now. This looks a little bit better. I have my product ID, supplier ID, quantity per unit, and unit price. What if I decided I wanted to add a field or two? I'm going to go back to my design of my report and click and drag around to lasso all of the objects. Now that I've selected all of them, I'm going to move them over to the left as a group. I'm also going to bring back up my field list. Now that I have my field list, I'm going to grab units in stock and bring that down to my report. I brought that down to my report. I'm selecting the title, Control X to cut it, click up on my header, Control V to paste it, and it's hiding over to the left, and at this point I can move it over. Again, move over my units in stock and size it down. I'm going to select both of them and send them over to the right. Let's preview again. Now you can see I have my product ID, supplier ID, quantity per unit, unit price, and units in stock. Later on, we're going to come up with a value that's going to take our unit price times our unit in stock. We're not going to do that quite yet. What I want to do is add a grouping to my report. I'm going to go back into design mode for the report. And in order to add a grouping to my blank report, I have this button right here on my toolbar, Sorting and Grouping. I'm asked what field expression I want to group or sort by and the sort order. The field expression that I want to group by first is my product ID. I want it sorted in ascending order. I also want a group header for my product ID, so I'm going to click right over here, use this pull down, and select Yes. I also want a group footer. I select group footer, use my pull down, and select Yes. I'm going to group on each value, but take a look and notice that you can also group on a particular interval. At this point, I'm also going to group on my supplier ID. I click on a new line and pick supplier ID and ascending, but I do not want a group header or group footer for my supplier ID. I'm going to double click to close down my sorting and grouping. Take a look at what's happened in my report design window. I now have a product ID header as well as a product ID footer. I've decided that I want to move my product ID field and title into my product ID header. I select the product ID and I can click and drag it down to the product ID header. I'm going to select the field and click and drag that up to my product ID header. Now I'm going to move, by selecting them all of these fields over to the left. For right now, I'm not going to put anything in my footer. Let's go ahead and preview and see what our report looks like. You can see that I have product ID number 1, and then I have one item, product ID number 2, product ID number 3, and so forth. What if I want to do it by supplier ID instead? I can close this down, take my product ID, I'm going to move my title back up here. I'm going to take my supplier ID title and move that down. I'm going to take my product ID field and just move it over for a moment. The supplier ID and move it up. And the product ID field and move it back down. So I can play as much as I want, moving things around. Select these and move them over. Let's print preview and see what we have. Now you can see that I'm grouped by supplier ID and then product ID. I'm going to go ahead and close this down and pull up my grouping again. Right now, I'm grouped first by my product ID and then by my supplier ID. But the way that I have my report set up right now, where I have a header, what I really want to do is change this, move the supplier ID up to the first level of sort. I selected it and I'm moving it up. And then I do want to have a group header for my supplier ID and a group footer for my supplier ID. If I take a look at my report right now, and I'm just going to move this box over, what I want to do is take these two controls and move them up to the supplier ID header because they'd be more appropriate there. I'm now ready to remove my product ID header because I've decided I'm going to group on my supplier ID. So we've seen how to add some groupings, and now we're seeing how to remove some groupings. I come over here to product ID and change group header to no, and also change group footer to no. And notice that now I no longer have a group header or footer based on my product ID. Let's preview now and see what we get. This makes a lot of sense. We have our supplier ID number 1, and then we have all of the products from supplier ID number 1, supplier ID number 2, and I have all of the products for supplier ID number 2. So this grouping makes a lot of sense. Let's go back to our report and review what we've done. We started with a blank report, and we used our field list to bring fields down to the report. We even added some fields after the fact. We added a grouping based on our product ID as well as on our supplier ID, but originally we had a group header and footer based on our product ID. We added an additional group header and footer based on our supplier ID, and then removed the group header and footer based on our product ID. Now I'm ready to add my calculated field. To add my calculated field, I'm going to use my toolbox, which is over on the left side of my screen. I'm going to use this tool right here, which gives me a text box, and click over in the detail section. This is currently an unbound control. Now, if the screen gets confusing to you, you can close down things such as your sorting and grouping, which we're not using any longer, and your field list, which we're not using any longer either. I'm going to delete this title right here. Select it and delete. And now I want to bring up the properties for this unbound object. I bring up my property list, and then as the control source, what I'm going to do is take my unit price times my units in stock. In order to enter my calculation, I'm going to click in control source, and to get some help from Access, I'm going to use the expression builder. Now that I'm in the expression builder, I can see the listing of my fields on report 1. I'm going to grab my unit price, put in an asterisk, a times sign, and then take that times my units in stock. Now I'm going to say OK and watch what happens. On my control source, it says equal unit price times units in stock. So I got some help from Access in adding this control. I'm also going to come up here to my label tool, click up to my page header, and put in the title total. Now I have my supplier ID footer here for a reason. What I want to do is put in a total of my unit price times my units in stock. Again, I'm going to get some help from the expression builder. I grab my AB tool and click down here in my footer. I'm going to go ahead and leave this title right here, bring up my properties box so I can see it, and again go into the expression builder. What I want is a function, which is the sum function. I'm going to go ahead and double click on functions and then double click on built-in functions. At this point, what I want is a sum function. I'm going to go ahead and drag the scroll box down and pick sum by double clicking on it. And I get some help knowing in the middle I need some sort of an expression. What I'm going to be summing is the product of my two fields. So I'm going to click and drag over expression and delete. Now I'm going to come back and click on report 1 and pull up my unit price times my units in stock. I don't need to worry about where I need brackets, the name of the function, or anything like that. I click on OK, and again, Access has built the expression for me. I'm going to move this box over and click on my text box over here, my label. For the caption, I'm going to enter the word total. So let's see what we get when we run our report. I'm going to print preview. Now you can see that what I've done is I've got supplier ID number 1, and I've got product IDs 1, 2, and 3. I have a quantity per unit, a unit price, a units in stock, and a total. I also have a grand total for all of the items in that particular grouping. The 702 plus the 323 plus the 130 equals the 1155. I go back to my design mode, and I can enhance this a little bit further by expanding this section, clicking and dragging over my titles and making them bold. I'm also going to bold and italicize my total title. Finally, if I wanted to add a report footer to the bottom of my report so that I can grand total the unit price times the units in stock, what I do is come up to the Format menu and select Report, Header and Footer. I now have a report header section, something that prints at the very beginning of the report, as well as a report footer section down here. What I'm going to do is simply take this control right here, do Control C, which is copy, click on my report footer, do Control V, which is paste, get my hand, and move these over. Because this is in the report footer, it understands to total at a report level rather than at a grouping level. Let's go ahead and print preview. Before we do that though, we need to make these titles just a little bit larger. I'm going to show you an easy way to do this. I'm going to select all of these titles, come up to the Format menu, Size, and Size to Fit. Now let's preview our report. Now you can see my titles are a little further away. I still have my totals and so forth. And if I go to the very end of my report, scroll up to find my entries, you can see that I have a grand total for the entire report. Remember that I can format the numbers if I want to make them look a little bit nicer. Now I'm going to show you how to add a page break after every supplier ID. What if for some reason you needed to break and have a new page after every supplier ID? The way that I can do this is with this tool right here. It's my page break tool. I'm going to click on my page break tool. I'm going to come down here to my supplier ID footer because I want to break after each supplier ID. I'm going to make sure I'm at the very bottom of the supplier ID footer as far as I can go without getting my no sign, and then click. I get a little symbol. Now let's go ahead and print preview again and see how this changed our report. Notice that on a page by itself is this particular supplier ID. And if I go to the next page, I get my next supplier ID. If you have a blank page in between your supplier IDs, what that means is that you did not place this page break symbol at the very bottom of the supplier ID footer. So you can move it down there. At this point, I'm going to delete my page break. Just to show you, if I click off of it, it's a little symbol, and if I select it again, you have to get your mouse pointer just in the right place. If you can't get your mouse pointer just in the right place to select it, you can always click and drag around it to select it. Notice now it has handles. I'm going to hit my delete key and print preview, and you can see that at this point I do not have a page break after each supplier ID. I'm going to close the window and click on my Save button to save this report and give it the name Supplier ID Grouping. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. At this point, I'm going to close down this report. Now you know some very powerful advanced reporting techniques. You know how to create a report from scratch, as well as how to combine several reports into one report. Also included on this tape, you learned about advanced queries. You learned how to include calculations in your queries, how to create multi-table and parameter queries. You learned some great advanced form design techniques. On the next tape, you'll learn how to import data from several sources. You'll learn how to embed graphic objects into your forms and reports. You'll learn how to integrate Access with both Excel and Word, and you'll get a great introduction to Access's powerful macro features. We've really enjoyed working with you and look forward to working with you again soon.